On the night of July 23, 1952, King Farouk of Egypt was at his summer palace in Alexandria when the phone rang with news that would end his reign within 3 days. A group of military officers calling themselves the Free Officers Movement had seized control of army headquarters in Cairo. Tanks were moving through the streets. The coup had been planned for months, quietly, inside a military that Farouk himself had commanded, by men who had served under his own flag and had decided that Egypt could no longer survive under him. Farouk was not entirely surprised. He had governed for 16 years through a period of mounting humiliation, first under British occupation that treated his throne as a formality, then through a catastrophic war with the newly formed State of Israel that Egyptian forces lost badly in 1948, and finally through a level of personal excess and public corruption that had become impossible for most Egyptians to ignore. He had gained enormous weight. His nightlife in Cairo's casinos was legendary and increasingly resented in a country where most people lived in poverty. His government was viewed as an extension of foreign interests rather than a national institution. Still, when the moment actually arrived, it moved with a speed that even Farouk did not expect. By July 26th, 3 days after the coup began, Farouk had signed an instrument of abdication in favor of his infant son, boarded the royal yacht Marusa at Alexandria Harbor with a 21-gun salute that the new military government granted him as a final courtesy, and sailed out of Egypt for the last time. He was 32 years old. He would spend the next 13 years in exile across Italy, Monaco, and France, living on what remained of an enormous personal fortune, gaining more weight, collecting cars and watches and rare objects with the same appetite that had defined his reign, and dying in a Roman restaurant in 1965 in a manner that Egyptian newspapers, still hostile toward him more than a decade after his fall, reported with barely disguised satisfaction. What happened to Farouk and his family across those 13 years, and what happened to the monarchy he left behind, involves a coup that started as a movement to reform the military and ended by abolishing an institution that had ruled Egypt for 150 years. Farouk became king in 1936, at 16 years old, following the death of his father, King Fuad I. The Egypt he inherited was, on paper, an independent kingdom. In practice, it remained heavily under British influence, a legacy of the decades British forces had spent occupying the country and controlling the Suez Canal, the strategic waterway that connected the Mediterranean to Britain's colonial holdings in Asia. Egyptian nationalism had been building for decades by the time Farouk took the throne, and much of Egyptian political life in the 1930s and 1940s was organized around the question of how, and whether, to finally push British influence out of the country entirely. The young king was, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely popular in his first years on the throne. He was handsome, athletic, and photogenic in a way that photographed well in the new mass media of the period. He spoke Arabic fluently, unlike his father, who had struggled with the language despite ruling Egypt. He was seen, at least initially, as a symbol of a more genuinely Egyptian monarchy than the country had experienced under his predecessors, some of whom had been criticized as being more comfortable in French or Turkish than in the language of the people they ruled. That early goodwill did not survive the 1940s. In February 1942, during the middle of the Second World War, British forces surrounded Abdeen Palace in Cairo with tanks and delivered Farouk an ultimatum: appoint a specific pro-British Prime Minister, Mustafa el-Nahas, or abdicate immediately. Farouk, humiliated in front of his own court and his own country, capitulated. He appointed Nahas. The incident became one of the defining moments of Farouk's reign, and not in a way that helped him. Whatever mystique the young king had carried into his early years evaporated in an afternoon when foreign tanks parked outside his own palace and dictated his government to him. Egyptian nationalists across the political spectrum, including many who would later go on to lead the 1952 coup, pointed to the Abdeen Palace incident as the moment they understood the monarchy could never deliver genuine independence, because the monarchy itself had just been shown to be subject to foreign control whenever Britain decided to exercise it. Farouk never fully recovered his early popularity after 1942. The war years that followed saw growing economic hardship, black market profiteering that was widely associated with the royal court and Farouk's inner circle, and an increasingly visible gap between the king's personal lifestyle and the conditions most Egyptians lived under. Then came 1948, and the war that did more damage to Farouk's standing than almost anything else in his reign. When the State of Israel declared independence in May 1948, Egypt joined a coalition of Arab states that invaded in an attempt to prevent the new state's establishment. Farouk personally pushed for Egyptian involvement, seeing an opportunity to position himself as a leader of pan-Arab solidarity at a moment when his domestic popularity badly needed the boost. The war went disastrously for the Arab coalition generally and for Egypt specifically. Egyptian forces suffered significant losses, and the war exposed a scandal that would become one of the direct triggers for the coup that ended Farouk's reign 4 years later. Egyptian officers serving in Palestine discovered that a portion of the weapons and ammunition supplied to their own army was defective, faulty rifles, corroded ammunition, and equipment that had been purchased through contracts tied to corrupt dealings inside the Egyptian government and, by extension, close to the royal court. Soldiers were dying in combat using weapons that malfunctioned because someone close to the top of the Egyptian state had profited from selling substandard arms to their own military. The officers who fought in that war and survived it, many of them young, educated, and increasingly radicalized against the monarchy they blamed for sending them into battle with defective equipment, formed the core of what would become the Free Officers movement. One of those officers was a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. The years between 1949 and 1952 saw Egypt sliding into a period of chronic political instability. Governments rose and fell with dizzying speed. Political violence increased. The Muslim Brotherhood, banned and then unbanned, grew in influence. British forces remained stationed around the Suez Canal zone despite growing Egyptian demands for their complete withdrawal, and clashes between Egyptian guerrilla fighters and British troops in the Canal Zone escalated through 1951 and into 1952. On January 26, 1952, a date Egyptians would later call Black Saturday, riots erupted across Cairo following a violent confrontation between British forces and Egyptian police in the Canal Zone city of Ismailia. Mobs burned foreign-owned businesses, hotels, cinemas, and clubs across downtown Cairo. Dozens of people died. The government that had been in power collapsed within days. Farouk, watching his country descend into chaos that his own government seemed incapable of controlling, responded largely by continuing his personal lifestyle much as before. He remained a fixture of Cairo's nightlife and gambling scene even as riots burned through the city center. The contrast between the king's continued extravagance and the mounting crisis around him became, for many Egyptians, and certainly for the officers planning against him, the final confirmation that Farouk himself was the problem rather than any particular government he happened to appoint. The Free Officers movement had been organizing secretly inside the Egyptian military since the late 1940s, built around the shared conviction of veterans from the 1948 war that Egypt's political system, with the monarchy at its center, could not deliver the independence and dignity the country needed. The organization was led nominally by General Mohammed Naguib, a senior officer whose seniority and reputation gave the movement legitimacy, but the actual planning and organizational core was built by younger officers, chief among them Nasser, who would eventually emerge as Egypt's dominant political figure for the following 2 decades. The coup itself, when it came on the night of July 22nd into July 23, 1952, was executed with a precision that surprised almost everyone, including much of the senior Egyptian military establishment that had no idea it was happening. Free Officers units seized army headquarters in Cairo, arrested senior generals loyal to the king, and took control of key strategic points across the capital, all within a matter of hours and with minimal bloodshed. Farouk, at his palace in Alexandria when the coup began, initially attempted to organize resistance, ordering loyal units to move against the coup plotters. Those orders either failed to reach loyal forces in time or were simply not obeyed, as the speed and coordination of the Free Officers' action had already secured control of the military's key command structures before any counter-mobilization could take effect. By July 26th, 3 days after the coup began, the Free Officers delivered Farouk an ultimatum that echoed, with a bitter irony that was not lost on anyone who remembered 1942, the same kind of ultimatum the British had delivered to him a decade earlier at Abdeen Palace. Abdicate in favor of his infant son, Crown Prince Fuad, or face consequences the Free Officers left deliberately unspecified. Farouk signed the abdication. The Free Officers, in a decision that surprised many observers given the depth of hostility toward Farouk personally, granted him a formal military departure. As Farouk boarded the royal yacht Mahrousa at Alexandria's harbor on the afternoon of July 26, 1952, Egyptian naval vessels fired a 21-gun salute, the traditional honor for a departing head of state. Some accounts from officers present describe the salute as a deliberate final courtesy extended by Naguib, who wanted the transition to be seen internationally as an orderly transfer of power rather than a violent overthrow, a framing that mattered enormously to a new government trying to establish its legitimacy both domestically and with foreign powers watching closely. Farouk reportedly told an aide, as he watched Egypt recede behind the yacht, that the age of kings was ending and that within 50 years there would be only 5 kings left in the world: the kings of England, diamonds, hearts, spades, and clubs. Whether he actually said this, or whether it is one of the many quotes attributed to Farouk after the fact by journalists eager for a memorable line, is impossible to verify with certainty. It has been repeated often enough in the decades since that it has become part of the standard telling of his departure, regardless of its actual origin. His infant son, Fuad II, technically became king of Egypt at not quite 1 year old, the youngest monarch in Egyptian history, ruling in name only under a regency council while the free officers consolidated actual power. The monarchy lasted less than a year after Farouk's departure. On June 18, 1953, the free officers formally abolished the Egyptian monarchy altogether and declared Egypt a republic, with Naguib as its first president. Fuad II, not yet 2 years old, was the last king of Egypt in name, having reigned for less time than most people spend deciding whether a title even applies to them. Farouk settled first in Italy, then increasingly split his time between Rome, the French Riviera, and Monaco, living on a personal fortune that had been built up over 16 years on the Egyptian throne and that he had, unlike Romania's King Michael a few years earlier, managed to move substantially out of the country before his departure. The scale of what Farouk brought with him into exile is difficult to establish with full precision, but by most accounts he left Egypt as one of the wealthiest exiled monarchs of the 20th century. He had spent much of his reign accumulating an enormous personal collection: jewelry, rare coins, antique watches, pornographic material that later became a source of considerable embarrassment when Egyptian authorities catalogued what remained in his abandoned Cairo palaces, and objects of every conceivable category that caught his interest, purchased with a combination of state and personal funds that had never been clearly separated during his reign. The new Egyptian government, in one of its early acts, auctioned off much of what Farouk had left behind in his Cairo and Alexandria palaces, a sale that ran for weeks in early 1954, and that drew international attention both for the sheer scale of the collection and for what it revealed about the extent of Farouk's personal excess. Newspapers around the world ran stories about the auction, cataloging everything from gold-plated bathroom fixtures to an extensive collection of pornographic photographs and films, material the free officers made a point of publicizing as evidence of the moral corruption they claimed had justified the coup. What Farouk had managed to take out of the country before his abdication was, by most estimates, still substantial enough to fund an exile of considerable comfort, though nowhere near the scale of his life as king. He rented villas in Rome and on the French Riviera. He continued gambling heavily, a habit that had defined much of his adult life and that reportedly consumed significant portions of his remaining wealth over the following decade. He gained a great deal of additional weight, adding to a physical transformation that had already been well underway during his final years as king, when photographs of an increasingly heavy Farouk had become a staple of both Egyptian and international press coverage. His marriage to Queen Farida, whom he had married in 1938 and with whom he had 3 daughters, had already ended in divorce in 1948, 4 years before his abdication. A divorce driven at least in part by his repeated infidelities and Farida's failure to produce a male heir until the divorce had already been finalized. Farouk remarried in 1951 to Nariman Sadek, an Egyptian woman considerably younger than him, and their son, the infant Fuad II, who briefly became king, was born just months before the coup that ended the family's reign entirely. The second marriage did not survive exile. Nariman, only 19 years old when Fuad II was born and barely into her 20s by the time the family settled into exile in Europe, divorced Farouk in 1954, less than 2 years after they had fled Egypt together. She later remarried, moved on with her life largely away from public attention, and Fuad II, the infant king, grew up primarily under his mother's care and later in boarding schools in Switzerland, a childhood that had almost nothing in common with what a king of Egypt's upbringing would have looked like a generation earlier. Farouk's exile years followed a pattern that observers at the time found simultaneously familiar and slightly absurd: an exiled king behaving in exile largely as he had behaved on the throne, without the state apparatus and the deference that had previously surrounded those behaviors. He remained a fixture of European high society and gambling circles through the mid-1950s and into the 1960s. He gave occasional interviews to international press, some bitter about his overthrow, others surprisingly candid about his own failures as a ruler. In several of those interviews, Farouk offered a version of self-assessment that was more clear-eyed than many observers expected from a deposed monarch. He acknowledged in various forms across different conversations with journalists over the years that he had governed poorly, that he had allowed corruption to flourish around him, and that Egypt's problems in the years leading up to 1952 had been real and had demanded a level of leadership he had simply failed to provide. This willingness to accept some responsibility set him apart from many other exiled 20th century monarchs, who more typically maintained in public that their overthrow had been entirely the fault of disloyal subordinates or foreign manipulation. Whether this reflected genuine reflection or simply a practical recognition that defending his own record publicly would accomplish nothing at this point in his life is impossible to determine with confidence. Both readings are plausible, and Farouk's own biographers have disagreed on which one better captures the man in exile. He remained politically watched even in exile, though nowhere near to the extent that Romania's communist government would go on to monitor King Michael during the same decades. Egyptian intelligence services under Nasser, who consolidated full power after pushing Naguib aside in 1954, kept some level of awareness of Farouk's activities and associations in Europe, wary of any effort by the former king to organize a restoration movement among conservative Arab states or European governments hostile to Nasser's increasingly assertive pan-Arab and non-aligned foreign policy. There is little historical evidence that Farouk himself ever seriously attempted to organize such a restoration effort. By most accounts, his interests in exile ran toward personal comfort and indulgence rather than any sustained political project to reclaim his throne. He appears to have understood, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that colored some of his later interviews, that the Egypt of the 1950s and 1960s, under Nasser's increasingly popular and internationally significant leadership, had no realistic path back toward a restored monarchy. Nasser's Egypt, in the years following the 1952 coup, transformed dramatically. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, triggering a major international crisis when Britain, France, and Israel launched a joint military intervention that ultimately failed under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, a failure that cemented Nasser's status as a hero of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial politics across the Middle East and much of the developing world. Land reforms redistributed agricultural holdings that had previously been concentrated among a small class of large landowners, many of them closely tied to the old royal court. Egypt became a leading voice in the non-aligned movement, positioning itself as an independent actor navigating between the Cold War's two superpowers rather than aligning fully with either. Every one of these transformations moved Egypt further from anything resembling the political and social order Farouk had presided over, and further from any realistic scenario in which a restored monarchy could have found meaningful public support even if Farouk had wanted to pursue one. Farouk's health declined steadily through the early 1960s, a consequence of the weight he had continued gaining throughout his exile years, combined with what appears to have been a general pattern of overindulgence in food, alcohol, and the general excesses that had characterized his lifestyle since his teenage years on the Egyptian throne. On March 18, 1965, Farouk was dining at a restaurant in Rome called Ile-de-France with a woman he had been seeing. According to multiple contemporary accounts, he had consumed a substantial meal. One report describes the meal as including lobster, a whole roast lamb, and multiple desserts, and shortly after finishing, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the table. He was 45 years old. The Egyptian press at the time, still deeply hostile to Farouk's memory more than a decade after his overthrow, covered his death with a tone that ranged from clinical distance to open mockery. Several Egyptian newspapers ran stories that emphasized the excess of the final meal as a fitting final chapter to a life defined by exactly that kind of excess. There was no formal Egyptian state acknowledgement of his death, no diplomatic condolences, nothing resembling the kind of recognition that other deposed 20th century monarchs, including King Michael of Romania decades later, eventually received from the countries that had overthrown them. Farouk was buried initially in Rome, but his remains were later transferred to Cairo in 1965 at the request of his family and interred at the Al-Rifa'i Mosque, the same mosque where several of his royal predecessors, including his father Fuad III, were buried. The Egyptian government under Nasser permitted the burial, a decision that some historians have read as a small, quiet gesture of reconciliation even amid the continued official hostility, though it may equally have reflected simple pragmatism, a recognition that denying burial rights to a former head of state, whatever the political circumstances of his overthrow, would have generated more controversy than allowing a quiet return of his remains to Egyptian soil. Farouk's children scattered across a European exile that in some ways mirrored, and in other ways diverged sharply from, the pattern Romania's royal family experienced during the same decades. His three daughters from his first marriage to Farida, Ferial, Fawzia, and Fadaya grew up largely in Switzerland and later across various parts of Europe, living private lives that mostly avoided the kind of public attention that had defined their father's reign in exile. None of them pursued any kind of political role connected to a hypothetical Egyptian restoration, a path that, given Egypt's political trajectory under Nasser and his successors, would have offered essentially no realistic prospect of success in any case. Fuad II, the infant king whose reign lasted less than a year and who never held any actual governing authority even during that brief period, grew up primarily in Switzerland under his mother Nariman's care after her divorce from Farouk in 1954, and later attended university in France. He has, across the decades since, maintained the largely symbolic title of head of the Royal House of Egypt, a claim recognized within certain international royalist and genealogical circles, but carrying no legal standing whatsoever within Egypt itself, a republic that has shown no indication across 7 decades of ever revisiting the question of monarchy in any serious way. Unlike Michael of Romania, who lived to see his citizenship restored, his properties partially returned, and who ultimately received a state funeral with attendance from crowned heads across Europe, Fuad II has never been permitted any kind of formal return to Egypt in any official capacity, and the Egyptian government has shown no interest across the decades since 1953 in extending any of the kind of gestures toward the former royal family that Romania's post-communist governments eventually extended toward Michael. The difference between the two trajectories, Michael's eventual, however grudging, reconciliation with a post-communist Romania, and the complete absence of any equivalent process in Egypt's relationship with the Farouk dynasty, reflects something real about the different character of the two revolutions that ended each monarchy. Michael's fall came at the hands of a foreign-imposed communist government that Romanians themselves, across the decades that followed, increasingly came to view as an illegitimate imposition rather than a genuine expression of Romanian political will, a view that created space, once communism itself collapsed, for reconsidering what had happened to the king who had once saved the country from its wartime alliance with Germany. Farouk's fall, by contrast, came from an Egyptian nationalist movement led by Egyptian officers responding to genuine and widely shared grievances about corruption, foreign influence, and military humiliation that Egyptians across the political spectrum had experienced directly. There was no equivalent moment of national reconsideration to be had, because the coup against Farouk was never viewed, even decades later, even after Nasser's own government gave way first to Anwar Sadat, and then to Hosni Mubarak, and eventually to the tumultuous political changes Egypt experienced in the 21st century, as an illegitimate imposition that history needed to correct. Egypt's monarchy remains, in the collective memory the country has constructed of its own 20th century, a chapter that was closed decisively and that the vast majority of Egyptians across the generations since 1952 have shown little appetite to reopen, revisit sympathetically, or reconsider. What Farouk left behind, beyond his family and his auctioned possessions, was a set of institutional failures that the free officers spent their subsequent decades in power both correcting and, in some cases, replacing with new versions of similar problems. The corruption that had characterized Farouk's court gave way to different forms of corruption and patronage under successive Republican governments. The foreign influence Egyptians had resented under British-dominated constitutional monarchy gave way to a complex set of Cold War alignments and later relationships with the United States and Gulf Arab states that Egyptian nationalists in later decades would come to view with a version of the same skepticism that had once been directed at Farouk's relationship with Britain. But the monarchy itself never returned, and Farouk, unlike Michael of Romania, never lived to see even the smallest gesture of reconciliation from the country he had once ruled. He died at a restaurant table in Rome, 13 years into an exile that had begun with a 21-gun salute and ended with a heart attack after a large meal. At 45 years old, a king who had inherited a throne everyone expected him to hold on to, and who lost it instead to a group of young officers he had commanded and never fully understood, in a coup that took 3 days to finish what years of corruption, war, and public excess had already made close to inevitable. If you want to see how a similarly extravagant royal court ended in an even faster collapse, Iran's Pahlavi dynasty fell in 1979 in a revolution that removed the Shah within weeks rather than days, and he too died in exile, stateless and unable to find a country willing to grant him permanent asylum. That video is next. There's a piece of the story that usually gets compressed into a single sentence, and it deserves more room than that. The actual mechanics of how the British had structured their control over Egypt for the decades before Farouk ever took the throne, because understanding that structure is the only way to really understand why a king with an army, a palace, and a crown could still be handed an ultimatum by foreign tanks in his own capital in 1942. Britain had occupied Egypt militarily since 1882, ostensibly a temporary intervention to protect British financial interests tied to the Suez Canal and to stabilize an Egyptian government that had fallen into serious debt to European creditors. The occupation, framed at every stage as temporary, lasted in various legal forms for 7 decades. Egypt was formally granted independence in 1922. A nominal independence that came with British forces retaining control over Egyptian foreign policy, the Suez Canal Zone, the defense of Egypt against external threats, and the protection of foreign interests and minorities inside the country. It was independence with an asterisk large enough to swallow most of what the word actually meant. The 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, signed the same year Farouk became king at 16, was supposed to formalize a somewhat more genuine Egyptian sovereignty, limiting British military presence to the Suez Canal Zone specifically rather than the whole country, and setting a 20-year timeline for renegotiation. In practice, the treaty still left British forces with enormous leverage over Egyptian political life, leverage that became starkly visible during the Second World War, when Egypt's strategic position made British control over the country's government a matter Britain considered essential to the entire North African campaign against Axis forces. That strategic calculation is what produced the Abdeen Palace incident in February 1942. Britain was fighting a desperate campaign against Rommel's Africa Corps in the Western Desert, and British commanders were deeply unwilling to tolerate an Egyptian government they viewed as insufficiently committed to the Allied cause, or worse, potentially sympathetic to the Axis powers given ongoing contacts between some Egyptian nationalist circles and Italian and German agents seeking to exploit anti-British sentiment. When Farouk's government proved unsatisfactory to British commanders on this point, the British ambassador, backed by tanks positioned around the royal palace, delivered his ultimatum. The specific prime minister Britain wanted installed, Mustafa el-Nahas, led the Waft Party, historically Egypt's most significant nationalist political movement, an irony that was not lost on contemporary observers. Britain was using military force to install the leader of Egypt's Nationalist Party, precisely because that party's structure and internal politics gave the British confidence that the government would maintain wartime order and cooperation, whatever the party's nominal anti-colonial rhetoric happened to say publicly. Farouk's capitulation to the ultimatum image, that of a king sitting in his own palace forced by foreign tanks to appoint his own government, became burned into Egyptian political consciousness in a way that outlasted the specific crisis by more than a decade. Young officers training in Egyptian military academies through the early 1940s, men who would later form the core of the Free Officers movement, frequently cited the Abdeen Palace incident directly in later interviews and memoirs as the specific moment they understood that Egyptian independence was a fiction as long as the monarchy remained the country's central political institution, because the monarchy itself had just been shown to bend completely whenever foreign force was applied to it directly. The war years that followed brought their own distinct pressures. Cairo and Alexandria filled with Allied troops, transforming both cities' economies in ways that generated enormous profits for a narrow class of merchants, contractors, and officials with connections to military supply contracts, while ordinary Egyptians experienced significant wartime inflation and shortages. The gap between wartime profiteers, many with direct or indirect ties to the royal court, and the broader Egyptian population living through rationing and rising prices, widened steadily across the early 1940s and fed directly into the political instability of the post-war period. By the time the war ended in 1945, Egypt's political landscape had fractured into a bitter, often violent competition between the Waft Party, various smaller nationalist and communist movements, the rapidly growing Muslim Brotherhood, and a palace that most political actors across this spectrum viewed, correctly, as fundamentally compromised by its wartime dependence on British protection. The Muslim Brotherhood's growth through this period deserves particular attention, because it represented a political and religious movement whose relationship with the monarchy Farouk never fully managed to stabilize in either direction. Founded in 1928, the Brotherhood had grown by the late 1940s into one of Egypt's largest mass movements, combining religious revivalism with a program of social welfare services, education, and increasingly paramilitary organization that positioned it as a genuine alternative power center to both the monarchy and the established political parties. Farouk's government alternated between attempting to co-opt the Brotherhood's influence and attempting to suppress it outright, a pattern that culminated in December 1948, when Prime Minister Mahmoud an-Nukrashi ordered the Brotherhood formally dissolved, following a wave of political violence attributed to some of its members. Weeks later, an-Nukrashi himself was assassinated by a Brotherhood member in direct retaliation. The following February, the Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna, was himself assassinated, widely believed at the time and since to have been carried out by Egyptian state security forces in retaliation, though the Egyptian government never formally acknowledged responsibility. This cycle of political assassination, state suppression, and further radicalization ran through Egyptian political life continuously across the final years of Farouk's reign, forming a backdrop of instability that made the country increasingly difficult to govern through any conventional constitutional mechanism, monarchy included. Farouk's personal transformation across these same years followed its own well-documented arc. The athletic, popular young king of the late 1930s had, by the early 1950s, become a figure whose weight, at various points estimated by contemporary observers to exceed 300 pounds, and whose visible taste for gambling, nightlife, and personal indulgence had become central to how both Egyptians and international observers understood him. Cairo's casinos and nightclubs, which Farouk frequented constantly even through periods of serious national crisis, became a recurring subject of both domestic criticism and international press coverage that increasingly framed the Egyptian king less as a serious head of state and more as a caricature of royal excess. Whether this reputation was entirely fair, or whether it reflected a degree of selective coverage that emphasized Farouk's personal failings while downplaying the structural constraints, British influence, a fractured party system, an increasingly radicalized military that limited what any Egyptian monarch could have accomplished during this specific period, remains a genuine question among historians of the period. What is not in serious dispute is that the reputation, fair or not, became politically decisive. By 1952, Farouk had become, in the eyes of a critical mass of the Egyptian officer corps and a significant portion of the broader public, a symbol of everything wrong with Egypt's political order rather than a figure capable of leading any kind of genuine national renewal. The specific mechanics of the 1948 war and its aftermath deserve a closer look too, because the defective weapons scandal that emerged from it did more concrete damage to Farouk's standing within the military than almost any other single event of his reign. Egyptian forces entered the war in May 1948 as part of a coalition that included Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invading the newly declared State of Israel with the stated aim of preventing its establishment and supporting Palestinian Arab claims to the territory. The war's early months saw Egyptian forces make some initial territorial gains, but by the war's later phases, Israeli forces had gained a decisive military advantage, and Egyptian units found themselves increasingly encircled and cut off, particularly in what became known as the Fallujah pocket, where a besieged Egyptian brigade that included the young officer Gamal Abdel Nasser held out for months under difficult conditions before an eventual armistice ended the fighting. It was during the siege and the broader course of the war that officers like Nasser first documented, in real time, the equipment failures that would later become a central grievance driving the Free Officers movement. Reports circulated among officers of ammunition that failed to fire correctly, weapons with mechanical defects that put soldiers at direct risk in combat, and equipment procurement processes that appeared to have prioritized certain suppliers with close ties to Egyptian officials over the basic question of whether the weapons actually worked. A parliamentary investigation into the arms scandal was launched in Egypt following the war's end, implicating several officials with connections to the royal court, though the investigation's conclusions were widely viewed within the military as insufficiently thorough and its consequences as insufficiently severe, given the scale of what officers on the front lines had actually experienced. This perceived failure of accountability, more than the defective weapons scandal itself, became one of the most frequently cited grievances among free officers in the years leading up to 1952, a sense that the system built around the monarchy was fundamentally incapable of holding itself accountable even when soldiers' lives had been directly endangered by corruption at the top. Nasser himself, writing later about his political formation, identified his experience in the 1948 war and the Fallujah siege specifically as the period when his own thinking crystallized around the conviction that Egypt's problems could not be solved through the existing political system, and that only a fundamental restructuring of the state, beginning with the removal of the monarchy, could address the underlying causes of Egyptian weakness and humiliation on the world stage. The auction of Farouk's possessions in early 1954 deserves its own closer look too, because the scale and specific contents of what was sold reveal something about both the man and the moment. The auction ran for approximately 5 weeks and covered items removed from Farouk's various palaces across Cairo, Alexandria, and elsewhere in Egypt. Catalogued items included an enormous personal collection of watches, one of the most extensive private watch collections in the world at the time, gold and silver objects, an extensive stamp collection that Farouk had pursued as a serious hobby since childhood, medical instruments, aspirin bottles, and medicine cabinets that had somehow made their way into the same auction lots as royal jewelry, and a substantial quantity of material that Egyptian authorities characterized as pornographic, an aspect of the auction that received considerable international press attention and that the new Egyptian government made a point of publicizing as evidence of the moral corruption of the deposed monarchy. International collectors, dealers, and curious buyers attended the sale from across Europe and the United States, and the total proceeds, while never precisely established in any single authoritative figure, ran into the millions of dollars by contemporary valuations, funds that went to the new Egyptian government rather than to Farouk himself. The scale of what remained behind in Egypt, set against what Farouk had actually managed to remove from the country before his departure, suggests that even the substantial personal fortune that funded his 13 years of European exile represented only a portion of what he had accumulated during his 16 years on the throne. The stamp collection in particular became something of a symbol in later retellings of the story, an oddly modest, almost bookish hobby sitting alongside the gold fixtures and the pornographic material, in a way that captured something of the contradictions in Farouk's character that biographers have never fully resolved, a man capable of serious, patient, detail-oriented collecting discipline in one part of his life, and reckless, indulgent excess in nearly every other part of it. Naguib's own role in the story is worth pausing on, because his subsequent fate reveals something about the movement that overthrew Farouk that gets lost when the story compresses into a simple narrative of Nasser as the coup's single author. Naguib had been chosen as the Free Officer's public face specifically because his seniority, His relatively moderate public image, and his reputation as a respected, somewhat conventional senior officer gave the coup a legitimacy and international respectability that a movement led publicly by younger, more radical officers like Nasser might have struggled to establish in its first uncertain months. Naguib became Egypt's first president when the republic was formally declared in June 1953. He did not remain in that position for long. Naguib and Nasser increasingly diverged over the direction of the new government through late 1953 and into 1954, disagreements that touched on the pace and scope of political reform, Naguib's preference for a quicker return to some form of civilian, multi-party governance against Nasser's preference for a more centralized, revolutionary transition period under continued military authority, and, more personally, an increasingly open rivalry over who actually held ultimate power within the new government. By early 1954, Nasser had maneuvered Naguib into a position of largely ceremonial authority, and following a further escalation of the conflict between the two men later that year, Naguib was formally removed from the presidency in November 1954 and placed under house arrest, where he would remain, largely out of public life and unable to speak to journalists or publish his own account of events, for the next 18 years. He was finally released in 1972, 2 years after Nasser's own death, by Nasser's successor Anwar Sadat, and lived the remainder of his life largely outside of active politics until his death in 1984. The removal of Naguib meant that the figure most Egyptians and most of the world had associated with the 1952 coup in its first formative year was erased from Egyptian public life within roughly 18 months of the monarchy's fall, replaced by Nasser, who would go on to dominate Egyptian and, for a period, broader Arab political life for the following 16 years until his death from a heart attack in 1970. Nasser's subsequent trajectory as Egypt's leader deserves at least a brief accounting here, because it directly shaped the country that Farouk, watching from exile in Rome and Monaco, would have recognized less and less with each passing year. The 1956 Suez Crisis, triggered by Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal Company in July of that year, a company that had remained under substantial British and French ownership and control even after Egypt's formal independence decades earlier, became the defining international moment of Nasser's presidency. Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated military intervention in October 1956, seizing the canal zone militarily within days. The operation succeeded tactically but collapsed politically within weeks, as both the United States and the Soviet Union, for their own separate Cold War reasons, applied intense diplomatic and financial pressure that forced the three invading countries into a humiliating withdrawal. The crisis, whatever its immediate military outcome, transformed Nasser into a genuine hero of anti-colonial politics across the Arab world and much of the broader developing world, a transformation that cemented his domestic political position in Egypt in a way that made any hypothetical restoration of the Farouk monarchy, already unlikely, effectively unthinkable for the remainder of Nasser's life and well beyond it. Land reform, launched almost immediately after the 1952 coup and expanded significantly through the 1950s, redistributed agricultural land that had previously been concentrated among a relatively small class of large landowners, a class that had included the royal family itself as one of Egypt's largest landholders, and gave that land to peasant farmers who had worked it for generations without ownership. The reforms reshaped rural Egyptian society in ways that directly and permanently dismantled the economic base that had underpinned the political power of Egypt's pre-war aristocracy, monarchy included. Farouk, watching all of this unfold from Europe across the 1950s, occasionally gave interviews commenting on developments in Egypt, generally maintaining a public posture that avoided direct criticism of Nasser's specific policies, while occasionally lamenting, in general terms, the direction his former country had taken. He never, in any documented public statement across his 13 years of exile, called for or endorsed any specific effort to restore the monarchy, a restraint that several biographers have read as reflecting genuine acceptance that such an effort would have been not just unsuccessful, but actively counterproductive to whatever remained of his own personal standing and comfort in exile. The broader pattern across Farouk's exile years, gambling, socializing, occasional interviews, steady weight gain, and a general absence of any sustained political project, contrasts sharply with the pattern of political engagement that characterized Michael of Romania's exile during the same decades. When Michael was training as a commercial pilot, working as a stockbroker, and eventually lobbying actively for Romania's NATO and European Union membership. Both men lost their thrones to movements that claimed to be correcting genuine national failures. Only one of them spent his exile trying to remain useful to the country that had exiled him. The difference likely reflects, at least in part, the very different personal formations of the two men. Michael had spent his teenage years as a figurehead king, watching Antonescu run a war he had no control over, then had orchestrated an actual, consequential political coup at 22 that changed his country's trajectory in the war, an experience that gave him both the political skills and, perhaps, the sense of personal agency that shaped his subsequent decades of exile activism. Farouk, by contrast, had spent his teenage years and 20s governing with considerably more direct authority than Michael initially held, and by most accounts had never developed comparable political instincts or comparable personal discipline, a pattern that persisted into his exile years in the form of gambling losses, weight gain, and a general absence of the kind of sustained, purposeful activity that characterized Michael's very different response to a broadly similar situation. Farouk's death in 1965 closed a chapter that Egyptian political life had, in practical terms, already closed more than a decade earlier. The country he had ruled had been transformed so completely under Nasser: land reform, canal nationalization, a new constitution, a one-party political system built around the Arab Socialist Union, an assertive, non-aligned foreign policy, that Farouk's Egypt of casinos, British ultimatums, and defective wartime rifles had become, for most Egyptians alive in 1965, a distant and not particularly missed memory rather than a recent political reality with any live claim on the present. That is, in the end, the sharpest contrast between Farouk's story and King Michael's. Michael lived long enough, 96 years, to see the political system that had destroyed his reign collapse in turn, and to see a substantial portion of his own country's population turn out by the hundreds of thousands to reclaim a connection to him that their own governments, communist and post-communist alike, had spent decades trying to suppress. Farouk died at 45. 13 years into an exile from a country whose new political order showed no comparable signs of reconsidering what it had done, and whose citizens, by the time he died at that restaurant table in Rome, had largely moved on to a version of Egyptian identity built around Nasser, pan-Arabism, and a republic that has now outlasted the monarchy it replaced by more than 70 years, a length of time that makes any hypothetical restoration look less like a live political question and more like the kind of historical curiosity you'd find in exactly the kind of video you're watching right now.